Welcome to episode 31 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. On this episode, we are going to be talking all about downward facing dog. We will dive into the anatomy and biomechanics of down dog, and then we'll talk about some alignment rules. For example, should you externally rotate your arms in downward dog? Should you ground your inner hands down? And where should your shoulder blades be? We will also talk about whether down dog is truly a resting pose, as well as strategies for working around pain or discomfort in downward dog, and probably a lot more. Before we dive in, just a little reminder about some of the ways you can support us and our work with this podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating or a review. You can sign up for Jenni's email newsletter to stay in the loop on everything at jennirawlings.com/newsletter. And that link will be in the show notes. You can also join our Strength for Yoga remote group training, which is our monthly strength training program for yogis. Use podcast 30 as a discount code for 30% off your first month. And that link will also be in the show notes. Jenni, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'd like to ask you what down dog is.
Now that is an excellent question, Travis. And downward facing dog is a super common, I think we could call it a quintessential yoga pose or yoga asana that many yogis practice multiple times in every class that they take. And downward facing dog, that's the English word for it, but the Sanskrit word is adho, mukha, svanasana. And what that breaks down to is that adho means downward, mukha means face, and shvana is dog. So, and then we add asana at the end of that. So adho, mukha, svanasana. I find a lot of people when they're doing like shorthand abbreviations for yoga poses, they'll abbreviate down dog as AMS. For Adho Mukha Svanasana. Yeah, I usually do DD for down dog. A little easier for me. But anyway, so that's just a basic intro. It's just a super common pose that most of us know. Classically, it's often done like right after the vinyasa sequence, where we might do like chaturanga into up dog and then back into downward facing dog. And then we usually hang out in down dog for say 5 or so breaths, something like that. What it looks like shape-wise is you could say like an inverted V. Yeah, like an upside down V. I had to think about that for a second. Where your hands and your feet are down and then your hips are piked up and you're basically in an inverted V. So if you think about that, remember the Sanskrit name Adho Mukha Svanasana. So the downward facing part at least is there because down dog is because your head is down below your hips. You are downward facing. And for example, handstands, which is kind of a related asana to down dog, like they have some similarities. Handstand, the Sanskrit term is Adho Mukha Vrikshasana, which would be downward facing tree. So Vrikshasana is tree. So you can see the similarity both in the shape, but
it's
also
all
the
coming
names
together. But where does the dog part come from?
That I don't know. Maybe just maybe the shape of that inverted V somehow looks like a dog with its hips in the air or something. I don't really know.
Maybe.
Where the dog part.
I could see that. Oh, sure.
Yeah, like a dog stretching back.
Yeah.
You know? I was going to say hands down, but I mean paws down, front paws down, and then it's hips. Yeah. But I must say, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but for handstand being downward facing tree, that confuses me a little bit because upright tree pose, as most of us know, that's, you're standing on one leg and then your other leg is in tree. Mm-hmm. But handstand's not really the inversion of that because both legs are straight.
Yeah, typically. It should be more like inverted mountain.
Yes. Adho Mukha Tadasana.
That has a nice ring to it.
Right. Or actually, downward facing arms up. Actually,
yeah.
That's Urdhva Hastasana. Anyway, but it's good. It's good to break down.
Good to think about.
Yeah, exactly. So bringing all that back, Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog. Does that kind of make sense? Put it a little bit in perspective now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of the basic gist. Do you think there's anything I forgot in just setting out the basics of the
No, I
body
don't think
movements?
so. I think we could talk about so you described the shape of the pose and what if you were going to go joint by joint, like
Mm-hmm.
anatomically speaking, what are your wrists, shoulders, hips, knees, ankles
Mm-hmm.
doing to get into that shape?
Yes. So in downward facing dog, your wrists are in some extension, but they're not in full extension. Like if you think a plank pose or
Mm-hmm.
something, that would be more toward full. That's like more that 90-degree, but you're pressed back from there, so it's not as much wrist extension.
Mm-hmm.
The shoulders are in a position of flexion, which is basically arms overhead. So that would be shoulder flexion. The spine is typically just relatively neutral, but there might be some extension and some flexion in some spaces, but we're not intending to like round the spine or particularly arch the spine in down dog. It's pretty much generally just neutral
Mm-hmm.
spine. Hips are in flexion.
Mm-hmm.
Hips are in flexion. The knees are straight, and the ankles are in dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion. So that's like where dorsiflexion is like where you flex your foot versus plantar flexion is where you point your foot.
Mm-hmm. So toes towards shins or
Exactly.
shins towards toes, since
Yeah, and down
the feet
dog.
are on the flat on the ground.
That's right. That's right. So those would be kind of like the major joint actions, don't you think there?
Yeah, I think the knees. You said knees are straight. Knees are mostly straight. I mean, depending
Oh,
on the person,
right.
right? Everything else,
Totally.
I think, is
Yes.
inarguable. But whether the knees are perfectly straight is something that we'll probably touch
Absolutely.
on.
Yes, you're right. I think we will probably talk about that, but
Straightish.
that's right. They do not need to be fully straight. They can be bent in people
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But classically, the picture of down dog that you see has straight knees.
Yes.
So yeah. So then, if that's kind of just like the joint positions for down dog, what would you say? Now, of course, maybe just to be a little clear, in this conversation today, we are mainly speaking about down dog as far as like biomechanics and movement and kind of like a movement science take on the pose. Because I'm about to ask you, like, why might we practice down dog or what is it offering
Mm-hmm,
for
mm-hmm,
our
mm-hmm,
body?
mm-hmm.
And when I'm asking you that, I mean that in the context of like biomechanically.
As opposed to like traditionally.
Yeah, it just
It,
comes here in the sequence, so we just do it
gotcha,
here. It's
gotcha.
the
But
pose in
what,
the
like,
book.
why might one choose to practice down dog from a physical standpoint?
Yeah, a movement standpoint. Yeah,
And
yeah,
then what things can a person run into along the way?
yeah. And like how might we change things? Like just
Mm-hmm.
having an understanding of what's happening, like mechanically in down dog, I think can be really informative for our why and like how and when, and also how we teach it. What we
Yeah.
say
Well,
about
and
it.
I think the big picture is that it doesn't always have to look one particular way.
That's right. Or even be practiced with one particular goal in mind. Because there's a lot
Yes.
going on, right? There's a lot going on in the pose.
As you just described. Yeah.
Right, right. So if we're thinking like biomechanically, what I don't maybe just kind of like some big picture explanations, like what's going on in down
Hmm.
dog? What's happening to our body? Why might we want to practice it?
Yeah. Well, I think the first two, well, maybe the one starter reason that isn't, I don't think, a very good reason is because people think of it as a resting posture.
Oh yeah.
So they're like, oh, we're going to go into down dog. And like you said, we're going to rest 5 breaths because it's considered a resting posture. So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk
Mm-hmm.
about that later. But from a biomechanical standpoint or an exertion
Right.
standpoint, that's a reason that's often given. But I don't think that's a good reason because, at least personally, I feel a lot of work in my body.
You
And
don't feel like
I've
it's a
heard
resting
that.
pose.
Yeah, I've heard that from other people as well. So that's a reason. I don't think that's a good reason. We can talk about that. But it
Right.
ties into these other things. So
No,
I think
yeah.
I think the better explanation that's more accurate is people tend to visit it for its stretching effects.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you feel a good stretch through your hamstrings, especially,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as well as potentially or probably your calves.
Right.
Because as you mentioned, we're in hip flexion, our knee is relatively straight. So that's putting tension on the hamstrings or a stretch
Yeah.
on the hamstrings. And then because the ankles are in dorsiflexion, now we're putting a stretch on the calves.
Mm-hmm.
So
Totally.
the flexibility or stretching component would be, I think, the first one people might think of. And then the second one would be that we're loading the upper body. So
That's right.
like you mentioned with the extension to handstand with the
Oh,
similarity of
right.
names,
Right.
the loading of the upper body is not that different. Like if you just looked from the wrist to the hip, you have
Mm-hmm.
a relatively straight line. And if you inverted that a little bit more, then you
Yeah.
would turn that into a handstand. So down dog is a good, if you're working towards handstand, down dog might be a good precursor
Yes,
to
for
handstand
sure.
from the upper body loading standpoint. So when you're standing on 2 feet, all of your weight is going into your feet. When you bring the hands down to the floor, now you've distributed the load between your upper and
Yes.
lower body and your whatever it is. And maybe do you know, have you looked at down dog on the bathroom scale with your hands on
It's a
top? I know
really
you
good
did for
question,
push up.
Travis. I did for push up and for like
Yeah.
some standing posts. I'm not sure that I did for down dog.
Yeah. Well, anyway, there's some distribution, and we will
Right.
talk about what that distribution, not the percentages necessarily, but how you can shift from
Mm-hmm.
loading the lower body more to
Right.
loading the upper body more. But as soon as you put your hands on the floor, there's some load that's going through the upper body from the hands through the wrists, through the elbows, and up into the shoulders, which are doing the most work to hold you in that pose.
That's
So
right.
to recap, uh, people will say it's because it's a resting pose, so they're going to hang out
Mm-hmm.
there. But actually, I think the true benefits or the more realistic benefits are that you're getting flexibility and you're getting some load through,
Yeah,
especially the upper body.
especially the upper body. And you mentioned the stretch for like the backs of the legs and loading for the upper body. But what do you think we could also think of there being some flexibility for the
Oh
shoulders
yeah,
as well?
right.
Like they're
So
loaded, like they're working, but they're also at an end range.
yeah, shoulders and perhaps thoracic
Yeah,
spine
thoracic
extension.
spine, the upper
If
mid
you
back.
think about the frequent assists that teachers will do coming around the room, right? You're in down
Mm-hmm.
dog and they'll press back right in the middle of your back to try to accentuate that
Sometimes,
extension.
yeah, yeah. Or for me, a little more often, what I'll see is like reaching the hips back, like pressing the
Yeah.
hips back, which I feel pulls the spine, might pull the spine into some more extension.
Yeah. So I guess that could take place at either, but where the assist is coming, whether it's more upper
Mm-hmm.
back or more at the hips, the effect is the same. By
Mm-hmm.
giving you some more extension through the spine,
Mm-hmm.
then that tends to help with the overhead motion of the shoulder at the glenohumeral joint.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's that like combination of multiple joints moving when you take your arms overhead.
Yeah.
So we think shoulders, but like the
We
thoracic
can
spine.
refer our listeners to our ABCs of the shoulder podcast.
Precisely, where we totally broke down the shoulder complex, the shoulder joint complex. Those were,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So actually, I have a quick question for you, Travis, about down dog and like the biomechanics involved. Would you say, or do you think the down dog is effective for core strengthening? And let's say when we're talking core, I'm meaning like the anterior core, like the abdominals. Do you think so? People say this, I find.
My
Do you think
first
it
answer
is?
is no. My second answer is maybe, but
Mm,
no, I don't see it. I like so much of the work is coming from pressing through the shoulders and trying
yes.
to relax through the posterior chain.
Right.
Like,
Right, right. So like the core.
sure, but you're okay. So if your core muscles, rectus abdominis, hip flexors, are stimulated through active hip flexion, then
Right.
the question is, well, is there active hip flexion occurring here? And I don't think so.
I don't see that personally. Yeah,
No, I think you're creating the hip flexion just through the pushing of the shoulders
that's
back.
right.
So, like, yeah, I guess you could try to get into down dog and fire, like,
You
isometrically
could like
contract
try to
those
pull
muscles.
your feet forward
Yeah,
or
but
something.
that's not. But it's not really that.
No,
It's
I
more
don't
the
think so.
shoulders that are
Yeah.
creating that. Okay, well, if I release the active shoulder flexion, then I come into plank.
Right. And actually, I was going to use the example of plank to compare it to down dog as far as this question about the core, because I think it's maybe a little more obvious for us to see that plank pose, where you're shifted forward and the shoulders over the wrist. That actually is a core targeter and again, we're saying anterior core, because if your abdominals were not working in plank, your whole belly and your hips would sag to the floor. That's what would
up dog,
happen.
essentially.
Yeah.
At the extreme.
So instead of that, you're working those very muscles in order to lift your hips up and hold them like buoyant above the floor. So plank pose, you can just see that relationship to gravity wants to pull like the spine down, and you counteract that to lift up. That's why plank is a core targeter. But if you compare that in your mind to down dog, where the hips are back, you're now at this angle. Your whole torso is at this angle. So that line of gravity isn't the same in down dog.
I know. What? Sorry. So you go ahead.
What were you going to say?
What would make it a core targeter is if your feet were on a yoga blanket.
That's true. If you wanted to turn down dog into a core targeter.
And that's an exercise
you're totally right.
We sometimes do in our programs, our strength for yoga programs, a blanket slide into.
That's right.
I forget what we call it. Plank to forward fold.
So we move through a down dog.
Yeah. You could just go between plank and down dog if you wanted. As kind of a shorter range of motion there.
Yeah.
But the reason that it's not really engaging the core is because there's friction on the floor that's preventing your feet from sliding back. So if there were no friction there, then your core would have to isometrically engage to prevent you from sliding from your down dog into your plank. But because we do yoga on frictive mats that are grippy, there's friction on the floor preventing your feet from sliding back, so your abs don't have to, and hip flexors don't have to do that work.
That's right. That's a really good thing to point out. So therefore, downward facing dog, it's not really a very potent stimulus for core strengthening, for like abdominal strengthening. It's more about the upper body in terms of like loading the shoulders, pushing the floor away, and then like that stretch through the hamstrings. Would you kind of like sum up? Yeah, and the shoulders. Would you kind of sum up like down dog and the general biomechanics that way?
Yes.
So why don't we turn, now that we've kind of established some anatomy and biomechanics primers for what's going on in down dog, why don't we turn our attention to just some like really common alignment rules that we find in the yoga world for downward facing dog. And take a look at them, like maybe examine them and see what movement science might suggest about some of these alignment cues. And I actually did put out a call to our audience for questions about downward facing dog before we recorded this podcast. And we got a lot of questions about all these points that we're going to be talking about. But this first one that we're going to address is the one that we got the most questions about. It's one that I personally have tended to, I've seen this, it's just a very common cue that I was taught and that I see taught in yoga classes everywhere for down dog. But this is the very common alignment rule we hear for down dog, that we should externally rotate the arms or the shoulders when we're in this pose. Like you press back into downward facing dog, and then once you get there, you're often cued to externally rotate, or it may not be that exact anatomical language, like in the context of a yoga class, but it might be some other cues that achieve the same thing, such as wrap the outer upper arms back or wrap your triceps back. These are just common cues I tend to hear that basically they're creating the same action. Or turn the eyes of your elbows to face forward. So turn the elbow creases forward. Basically, that's another cue that's meant to encourage that external rotation. To me, the idea is like you enter downward facing dog, but once you get there, it's like not enough, or it's not good enough to just stay there the way you landed. But instead, you're supposed to do something to like layer on this conscious change, which is to consciously externally rotate the shoulders while you're there. Like it's not correct to just be there without that. Like you have to layer that on. That's the idea.
Body's not doing it right.
Exactly. Now, in my experience with this cue, I find that it's often like if you were to ask a yoga teacher, why are you offering that cue?
Mm-hmm.
I find that it's often the case that teachers just teach it because it's just what they learned in their teacher training.
Yeah.
If you have a yoga teacher training handbook and it's got like all the asanas and then quote the cues, and it's like a bullet point. These are the things you say in these poses. This is how they're often laid out.
Common, like if you take a yoga teacher training, they'll give you a manual with the poses, and then there's going to be cues, and they'll tell you the cues, but they won't necessarily tell you why.
Yes, that's definitely very common. And I wouldn't say that in a blamey way. It's just like in a 200-hour yoga teacher training.
Yeah.
Where you have so much, you're supposed to pack in so many subjects. Like anatomy is a very small slice, Yep,
I get that.
So, and you have so many poses to go over.
I don't completely get it, but I know that that's a thing.
Exactly. I understand that
conceptually that in a 200-hour, there's a lot to cover, and anatomy seems to be something that gets a little shortchanged, hence the relevance of our podcast.
Yes, we're kind of trying to like fill in a lot of the gaps that are often left behind, understandably so, in a 200-hour teacher training.
And you can imagine that these manuals are already pretty long with all the poses and all the cues. So if you added a third column to these tables and said, here's the reason why for the cue, you're suddenly, one cue, externally rotate the shoulders, wrap the triceps back, wrap the elbow creases forward. Mm-hmm. Suddenly you need another paragraph to explain what's going on anatomically, and your manual becomes 100 pages longer.
Not to mention all the other stuff in a yoga teacher training that's also taught, like the yoga philosophy, the yoga history,
right?
Sequencing, like so much, like we're just talking about the poses. So I think it's completely understandable why one might come out of a yoga teacher training and not really know the biomechanical why behind why they might teach to externally rotate the shoulders. They just teach it because they were taught that like, this is what you teach.
Got it.
You know what I mean?
So that's like level 1. And then level 2, there might be teachers who are teaching it because
they have been explained to like the reason why.
Mm-hmm.
Which, in my experience, the reason why, beyond just like we do it this way because we do it this way, has to do with safety, like shoulder safety or protecting the shoulders from injury.
That famous word, we do this to protect.
Yes, exactly. Which some people mentioned so often. Yeah, they did. You mean in the questions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah. So like what's the connection between needing to externally rotate the shoulders and potential shoulder safety or protecting the shoulders? So in many teacher trainings, you might just get the explanation, like we do this for safety, or we do it to prevent injury, end of story, and no further explanation. But in some teacher trainings, or maybe like a 500-hour setting, or maybe a teacher training that like advertises itself as being more anatomy focused, some trainings say that. Then you might get more of the actual anatomical or like patho-anatomical explanation.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by patho-anatomical?
Patho from the word pathological, like going to be bad for you, basically. Mm-hmm. Would you agree that that's what patho is? And so, and then you layer that onto anatomy.
Yeah, I love that word.
You do? The word patho-anatomical.
Yeah, I just think it's a cool word.
I think you just to say, like to roll off the tongue.
But patho anything actually, like pathophysiology.
Yeah, I like that too.
That is sometimes offered.
Right.
Not by me.
Yeah, not by me either. But yes, so there are some ideas around the shoulders in down dog, which, as we mentioned, downward facing dog has the shoulders in flexion. So it's an overhead shoulder position pose. Now, if we kind of step away from yoga and maybe think more in, like physical therapy or like the medical side of things, there's this line of thought that when the arms are overhead, there can be issues with that position that can, in some people, if they have patho-anatomical or pathokinesio ways of moving, I don't know if that's the right word, but in some people who are moving in faulty ways, they can be doing something in their shoulders that might cause this like pinching or compressing, or the word that the buzzword we all hear is impinging of some tissues in the shoulder, specifically one of your rotator cuff tendons, the supraspinatus, and or a bursa, this like fluid-filled sac that lives in the shoulder joint. It's usually one of those two structures. Is said. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Sounds ominous.
Yeah, the subacromial bursa.
Yeah, issues in your tissues.
Exactly. Those tissues getting impinged between bones in the shoulder. And specifically, just to break it down a little more, but again, like you said, we can refer people to the ABCs of the Shoulders podcast, where we talk in depth about the shoulder complex. But there's a structure on the scapula or the shoulder blade called the acromion or the acromion process. And that kind of projects forward and creates this roof over the head of the humerus or the upper arm bone. And there's this space between them that's got this fancy term, the subacromial space, like sub being underneath. So the space underneath the acromion. And this idea coming out of like the rehab world, for lack of a better term, is that subacromial space is it's important to maintain. And if it gets too narrow, that's what can cause the pinching of the tissues that live there. Do you think I'm describing? And that specifically happens when the arms lift overhead. Specifically.
Yeah, combination, especially it can occur. There's thought to occur with flexion, also exacerbated by internal rotation. Dun, dun, dun.
Right. And protected, or like the space is kept wider with external rotation. So when the arms go up, when you actively externally rotate, the idea is that creates more subacromial space and is less likely to impinge those tissues.
And that pain is usually felt on the front of the shoulder as like how would you describe it? Stabbing, or
I think it's like a kind of a sharp. I don't know because I haven't personally experienced it, but I would imagine like a sharp pain in the front of the shoulder. Would you say?
I think that's correct.
So this is very common. We know shoulder pain is super common in people, and it's also very common to experience shoulder pain when the arms lift. That's a very common like movement that's associated with this painful experience. Of course, not in everyone, but it's a common, painful pattern that we see arising.
And the way that physical therapists will often assess for this subacromial impingement is by putting a person in that provocative position of shoulder flexion coupled with internal rotation, which is called the Neer's test.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned Neer, because I did a little research on like the history of impingement, or like ideas around impingement. And Neer, maybe you know this, but Neer was a surgeon back in the 70s who proposed the whole theory of shoulder impingement. He was a surgeon, and he just felt through his own observations of looking at shoulders that he was operating on. He just decided that he was identifying this pattern. And he kind of declared or proposed that there was this mechanism for this shoulder pain that was showing up in people. And that is basically this pinching of those tissues, and that it's more likely to happen in people who have the acromion process shaped in certain shapes. Like there's certain bony variations.
Three.
Yeah.
There are
three
names.
Variations. Exactly. Yeah. Names for sure. Yeah. I think it's like the hooked variation is more.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds right. I was going to say 1, 2, and 3, but
I think it's 1, 2, and 3, but I think 3 is the hooked. I think.
Okay. That sounds good.
So basically, Neer, the surgeon, proposed this back in 1972, but it was, like I said, it was based on his observations, and it wasn't actually looked at like in research or tested, more empirically. It was just like, he was like, I'm seeing this pattern, this is my theory, but it ended up catching on and kind of becoming the working model of this is basically what gets blamed for tons or the majority of instances where people have overhead arm shoulder pain. Like you said, they'll do tests like to, provocation tests to like test for it, but it's super common. Subacromial impingement syndrome, or SIS, is the technical like term for it. It's been kicking around for a long time. And it really all dates back to this one man and this theory that he came up with, like one person, one theory that wasn't really tested, but just kind of sounded right. Like, oh yeah, bones can come together and tissues can get pinched. That seems like it would be painful. So yeah, that makes like, it just, it it wasn't really examined beyond that. It just kind of was maybe an assumption. And what's grown out of that now is, we have super widespread surgeries that happen to the shoulder where they literally go in and shave down the bony acromion process to make more subacromial space.
And do those surgeries seem to work?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. We actually have lots of research, especially super recent, like today, that shows that's called an acromioplasty. That's what that surgery is called. That actually, as far as people getting out of pain, an acromioplasty performs no better than a placebo. So a placebo surgery, it's like they'll give two groups of people. One people get the actual acromioplasty, and others they get a procedure, but they don't actually shave down the bone. It's
right. I think the person doesn't know whether they've had the surgery or not. They've been randomly allocated to one of the groups, but they don't know, and they'll still like do the incision.
Right.
They'll put the person under, do the incision, and so it'll look, and then they'll stitch
like
them back
they had
up.
A procedure.
They won't actually shave down the acromion, but the person will see. Oh,
they were like,
they went in, and they closed it up. Something must have happened.
And there's no difference between the actual surgery and the sham. That's also called like a sham surgery.
Which is just wild.
Isn't that crazy? And we have lots of data of that also happening in other areas of the body, like at the knee and the meniscus. I think didn't you just report on, review a study on that for Physio Network?
It was similar to that. It was comparing people who did and didn't get the surgery or who opted for it later.
Oh, okay. So
there was no sham.
Right.
But
okay.
A similar instance of a surgery that may not need to be done.
Right. So in addition to, it's pretty damning to just know that actual shoulder surgery doesn't work any better than sham shoulder surgery. Yeah. But also the acromioplasty doesn't work better than just exercise and physical therapy.
Yeah.
Where there's no surgical intervention.
I think the one, I totally agree that it's damning. The one thing is like they both kind of work.
Right.
So
that's
it's not
so true,
to
Travis.
say,
yeah.
It's not to say that people don't get better after the after the acromioplasty. It's just like, well, you could have not done it and thought you did it.
Exactly.
So, which does lend itself to, hey, we probably shouldn't be doing this
because it's invasive. Not to say that, and it's expensive.
There's so many risks. It's expensive.
And there's risks.
It's because it's no better than the placebo. That goes to show that it's not necessary. But it's not to say that it doesn't work.
Yeah, you're totally right, Travis.
It doesn't work because of the pathoanatomical explanation. Right. Because people who think they've gotten it,
such a good point.
They also seem to get better at a similar clip rate.
And
I don't know if those studies that have compared the surgery to no surgery, like what percentage of those people are getting better, however that's defined.
I had a review that I had just looked at in preparation for this that showed it was like about the same, and both like short-term and long-term. As far as
do you remember the percentage of people who seem to report improved function?
Oh, like pain? out of the whole. I don't remember that. But we can link the study in the show notes.
Perfect.
So people can check that out. But anyway, the point being, it's just like, and like you said, the surgery might work for a good amount of people, but the reason that it works doesn't seem like it's because more subacromial space was created and because the bone was actually changed. It might be for other reasons. It might be because the person who got the shoulder surgery just got to rest the shoulder for several weeks as it healed. It might be because they believed, they're just like we talked about in our Which Yoga Educator Should I Trust episode, and like the post hoc fallacy and all of this, like trying to identify mechanisms. It gets complicated. So all of that is just to say that when it comes to something like shoulder pain, when you lift your arm overhead, you don't actually need to physically change the subacromial space and make it larger in order to get out of pain. So what was causing the pain in the first place? Was it because of the subacromial space? Was it even because those tissues were being impinged? Like we know that it's just natural for tissues to be compressed and squeezed as the body moves around.
That's a really important point.
And it happens all the time.
Impingement happens to
Yes,
everybody. For some people, it's painful. For some people, it's not.
that's
But
right.
the subacromial space is small, and there's a lot of tissues going through it, and
Yeah,
it compresses as you raise your arm up. And for some people, that is bothersome, and for some people, it's not.
exactly. So it's not inherently like a bad thing. It's just kind of part of natural movement.
Mm-hmm.
It was just an assumption that seemed to be laid on that like that seems like that could cause pain and that's why that person has pain. But we don't. Pain is so multifactorial, right, Travis? Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's so many things that could go into the experience of pain when your arm is overhead.
Yeah. So when you give somebody a diagnosis, a label like
Yes.
subacromial impingement syndrome, what can happen?
That is, and specifically that diagnosis in general, specifically like with the word impingement. But what I think can happen there is it could serve as a nocebo, which can can lead to more pain potentially being created because people just believe they have this belief that may not even be true about what's going on in their shoulder. But it also can make people afraid of moving. It can make them afraid to lift the arm overhead. And that can just snowball into creating more pain because we know motion is lotion in general. Like movement in general is healthy for our joints if you stop moving. That can actually create
fear, stopping moving, creating fear of movement.
Yes.
Increase the pain.
And that term impingement in general is just kind of a scary sounding term. It just sounds like impinge, like I'm really scared right now. Which is why the updated, like more evidence-based take on this whole topic has been to retire that term completely and to not use SIS, subacromial impingement syndrome. Like we don't like to not use that term anymore. And it seems to be what current thinking is to replace that term with a term called rotator cuff related shoulder pain. That seems to be one term that people are liking. And then there's also subacromial pain syndrome. I think that's what it's called, is the other one.
Both
some people, Go ahead. Some people don't like the subacromial pain syndrome because it's still pointing out one specific location, which makes it so specific, which it may not be that specific. And also if people Google that diagnosis, if they're like, I was diagnosed with this, I Google subacromial, no matter what, you're going to get a bunch of Google listings that are all about the scary impingement, because
I think both of them are better. It's funny because they're both less specific, and that seems to be the way we're moving,
the trend
away from like these very specific, this is exactly what's wrong, to just more general like, oh, your shoulder hurts. And we have a name for that, and it's called rotator cuff related
shoulder pain, I think.
Pain,
yeah. Right.
Which basically just like my shoulder hurts in the area of my shoulder.
I diagnose you with that.
Yeah. So I think that those are, well, I was going to say was we're mentioning this as the newest state of the art medical approach to talking about this. I wouldn't say that this is the new normal.
Yes, Travis.
You'll still hear plenty of people talking about subacromial impingement syndrome who haven't come around or even been exposed to these newer ideas, which are fairly new, right? Like I would say within the last few years, at least the last few years that they're coming across my radar. Yeah,
I definitely agree. It seems to be the newest line of thinking and what's coming out from newest research. But as we know, it takes a long time for a significant amount of time for insights from research to trickle down to levels of clinicians, let alone just lay people.
Especially so therefore that's been around for 50 years.
Yeah. Since 1972. And it was like one man had one idea. I think we talked in our episode on how to think more scientifically. We suggested that like when one person just comes up with this one whole idea or system or, like in one day I just came up with this, it's rare that actually ends up being like supported by research. So it's just interesting, like what we have in our hands now. So all of that about impingement is to kind of bring this back to the yoga alignment rule. It makes a lot of sense to me that, of course, in the yoga world, especially the yoga world, because we know that the yoga world isn't necessarily super up to date on all of this evolving research about the body, movement, and pain. So, of course, we're going to have some older ideas about the way things work and about the way pain works. I mean, that's our whole podcast tends to be about that quite frequently. So it makes sense we learn in yoga teacher trainings that it is important in downward facing dog to consciously externally rotate the shoulders in order to prevent impingement. That's like what you might learn in a yoga teacher training. I think you and I, Travis, are here to suggest that actually that's probably not necessary. Like we're probably not in danger with the arms overhead in downward facing dog. Our nervous system like knows how to coordinate our bodies, our muscles, our joints, and we can probably trust that and just not layer on. Like, would you suggest that teaching people into downward facing dog and then cueing now externally rotate the shoulders? Would you suggest that maybe like a micromanaging cue that's just not necessary?
But, yeah, I think from the standpoint of preventing injury or pain, and in particular this syndrome that we're not even calling a syndrome anymore,
Yeah,
that's probably not necessary. You might choose to do that from a purely muscular engagement standpoint,
yes,
just to feel what it feels like.
that's right.
But that's a very different rationale and experience and thought process and narrative.
100%.
You might go into external rotation, and then you might go into internal rotation and feel what it feels like, or nothing at all, or nothing at all.
Right. It's like just as a baseline cue when when the general group of people are in down dog.
This doesn't have to be a default thing that you're layering on to volitionally do something on top of what your body's naturally doing.
That's right. But you certainly, like you said, you could add that in like occasionally with one specific intention for the moment. Like let's externally rotate now. Now let's internally rotate, go back and forth. You could do the same thing at the hip joints, externally, internally rotating down dog as an exploration or a mobility drill. Like there might be different reasons why you might do this, but those are like specific examples that are not just like your default, your default way that you would teach.
And I would say the one situation where you might, the one counterexample would be if you are having pain in your shoulders in that position, and you do try externally rotating and it feels better, then that's okay. Yeah. It doesn't mean necessarily that you always have to do it that way. Maybe could be a temporary modification.
That's right.
As your shoulder is calming down.
So it could be a helpful cue for an individual in an instance like that, where maybe they have pain otherwise. So one suggestion, there are many suggestions that you could throw at someone to try to work around pain. Yeah. That's one of many.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those.
That's right. But that's certainly one valid thing that may help an individual alleviate pain. So for sure they should. It's not that it's like a bad cue. Like no cue is inherently bad or good. I think what we try to like talk about in our work together is this more just like these ideas about this one, set of cues or alignments that must be done in order to protect the body, blah, blah, blah. It's more about that. It's like, what's your reason behind the cue? If you're teaching externally rotate because you think everyone needs to do that, either because you were just taught that's just how we do it, or because you were taught this is safer. Like neither of those reasons are reasons that we need to teach that cue in down dog. Yeah.
I think that was a thorough treatment, and it ties into
our next one.
Yeah, that we were talking about. So what happens, Jenny, or what if you externally rotate the shoulders, what can that then create at the hand?
That's a great question, Travis. If you're in down dog, we're picturing, if you're in down dog, if you externally rotate the shoulders, and I know this can be a little tricky if you don't quite know anatomy and the way that the body moves, but like if you picture you're in down dog, when you externally rotate, that means you would roll the outer arms back or wrap the triceps back. So the whole arm would spin in this way in which the weight all the way down in your hands, because it's all connected, right? The whole kinetic chain, the weight in your hands would roll toward the outer hands. You would shift more weight into the outer hands and you'd have less weight in your inner hands. Would you agree? Like that's kind of the tendency there if you externally rotate.
Yeah, if everything below that is moving along with that, if you externally rotate the shoulder, then it's going to, if you're looking down at your right arm, the external rotation would be clockwise, and that would go down from the shoulder to the elbow to the wrist to the hand. Yeah. And your hand would be, it's not going to necessarily move, could move.
It could move, yeah.
If the floor were slippery, but if you have a grippy mat, it's just going to create like a corkscrewing effect.
Right. That's right. And more weight would shift into the outer hand. And then we can kind of add on to that with just like maybe external rotation cue aside, because maybe a teacher hasn't taught that or someone's not doing that.
That can just happen.
It can just happen where people are in down dog and the weight rolls to the outer hands and the inner hands. Sometimes the inner hands actually lift, and specifically like the base knuckle of the first finger or the base knuckle of the index finger kind of lifts away. This is a very common in yoga. We tend to be taught that this is this alignment no, or it's bad alignment when you look at someone in down dog and you see that lift of the inner hand.
So what do they tell you? What do they? What's the first cue on the teacher training manual is externally rotate the arms. The second cue is
that's right, Travis, is to press the base knuckle of your index finger down, or just maybe more generally ground your inner hands. Something along those lines. Or ground down through all 5 base knuckles evenly. That's another one I hear, like ground down through all 5. But the point is like to spread the weight to the inner hand
sure
where
that,
you probably
like cupping or tenting of the inside
of the
palm, yes, is not occurring.
right. Like so that it's like the palm is relatively flat and all those knuckles are grounded. Some sort of cueing. Yeah.
What do you think about that?
What do I think I certainly experienced it's very common to see people when they're bearing weight on the arms in down dog that they do have that lift. I used to think it was a problem, and I definitely used to cue to ground that down for sure. But since I've learned a lot more about the body and movement and pain, I've changed the way that I think about that. I think instead that's just kind of like the natural way that your body is just coordinating itself in that position. I don't see it as inherently injurious to like have a little more weight on the, like I think we can handle. I've seen like yoga anatomy articles written about this where they say it's injurious.
What do they say is going to happen?
That's a good question. I don't remember the exact thing. I think just like injury to the wrist or things like that. It's just bad. It's just bad for you.
Just bad.
Right. Let alone the fact that if you think like rolling all the way to the outer wrist and then maybe you do something like forearm plank or headstand where you've like interlaced your fingers. I don't know if people can picture that as I'm describing it, but you've got your entire side outside of your hand down on the floor, the outer wrist.
You mean to say that can bear load?
That's the question, right? So just like we don't tend to think about it in like headstand or like so forearm plank. We don't always do forearm plank with hands interlaced, but sometimes we do. We don't think about it there, but for some reason in down dog, a little weight in the outer hands is supposed to be injurious. It is, wow. Travis. So you and I made a great video about this that I think we'll link in the show notes.
Sure.
We kind of broke this down. I really like this video. But what we showed or suggested in the video is like, yeah, this is very common in down dog that you have that inner hand lift. But check out what happens when most people, once they shift from down dog into a position where actually they're bearing more weight on their arms and hands, like say plank pose, let alone arm balances, crow pose, handstand, what tends to happen is naturally that lift of the inner hand naturally comes down once the upper limb is bearing more weight. It'll just like press it down. It's not like something that even comes up in those poses. It tends to, in my experience. So it's like you don't have that much, that much weight in your upper body in down dog. So maybe that's just how it's naturally organizing itself. But if you shift forward into plank and you look at your hands, you probably notice that there is more of that grounding of the inner hand. It just kind of pushes itself down as there's more weight. Do you agree?
I agree with that. Yeah. So basically, what we're saying is the cue is often to externally rotate the shoulder. And then because now you've created this lifting of the base knuckle of the index finger, now you have to counteract that. So you're corkscrewing in one direction at the upper arm, the opposite direction at the forearm and wrist and hand. And it's like, what is the point of all of this? Like, why are we going into the weeds on this thing that doesn't even matter?
Exactly. It's like this overly complex puzzle that we're asking yoga students to figure out, like how they click in with that right
especially
alignment.
From the injury prevention standpoint.
Yes,
if you want to
Travis,
play with that for the experience and the sensation and the muscular engagement, that's fine. But I don't think it has to be a mandatory, these are the cues that I spit out every time just because I don't know why, or because I think that I'm protecting the body that doesn't need protecting in this case.
That's right. Like they don't need to be these default alignment cues that are just universal, what we always do in these poses, but they can be fine to explore and experiment from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
I like how you said that. So that is a great look at both this external rotation cue in down dog and the ground the inner hand cue in down dog. So let's move on to some of the other things we wanted to look at as far as alignment in down dog goes. And the next one on our list is to take a look at down dog length, or that distance between where your hands are and where your feet are. I know this one people wonder about this a lot, like what's the right length for downward facing dog?
I've wondered about this. And then I watched your YouTube video and answered all my questions.
That's so great. Should we link that YouTube video also in the show notes?
Definitely. That's good.
I think I'm pretty sure I got it. Oh, that's right. In all my YouTube videos. I know that video is just me, but I'm pretty sure I got your feedback on. Like, I think I asked your feedback before I made it. Like, what do you think about?
That must have been why I liked it so much.
Yes, but it's this video I have that's called "What's the Right Length for Down Dog?" I think that's what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I made it because I know a lot of people wonder about this. And in my experience, a very common rule for down dog length is that the quote correct length for down dog is that you start in plank pose, then you keep your hands and feet exactly where they are, and then you send your hips back into down dog. And then where you land, that's where you stay. That's like your down dog alignment.
I kind of like that rule. Not that I think it's a good rule. It like makes sense. There are so many rules that don't make sense to me, but that one, it's like, oh, okay, well, we're in plank, and then we move from plank to down dog, so like that's
quite a bit.
But the only way that it doesn't make sense is what if we start in bear, which I know isn't a real pose per se. Bear being hovering tabletop or tabletop.
Yeah,
and then you wanted to go from tabletop to down dog. Now that's not the same length.
But that's what hands and knees. Yeah, that's not the same length as plank pose, bear and hands and knees.
Right, it's shorter. So
yeah, exactly. So you end up in a shorter down dog. Yeah. So my impression and what I actually said in that video is that I think the plank rule is actually a good starting point. Mm-hmm. Like I think it's not bad, and I think it's a good general idea. And where I think that instruction comes from, or one motivating factor, is that I think it's partly a reaction to what many people do when they come into down dog from plank, because that's such a common transition, plank and press back, is many people are in plank, they press back to down dog, and then they may not even think about it, but they naturally step their feet forward a little bit. It's like a little step, and then they shorten the stance. And that's I know I used to do that. I remember that being super common, like in the Ashtanga world.
But not anymore.
Yeah, I don't do that. No, that's right. The reason the reason I was doing it, and the reason I think many people do it, is because a shorter down dog is actually an easier down dog in many ways, not in all ways, but it means that you have less load on your upper body if you shorten the stance a little. It's subtle, but it's there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it just makes it a little easier, a little less work. And I think that's my theory as to why many people do that consciously or unconsciously.
From the loading of the upper body standpoint.
That's a really great point. It can be more restful that way, unless someone's hamstrings are tight.
Unless you're me.
Yeah, because when you shorten down dog, then you actually make it a bigger hamstring stretch. So then it may be less restful as far as stretching goes. So many variables, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, I believe that like the start in plank and keep your hands and feet there and press back is partly a response to the constant shortening that people do, because there's just like a default idea, like, well, it's going to be better for us, I guess, in terms of it's harder, so therefore it's better. If that's what you're thinking, it's better to keep a slightly longer length. That is my theory. It's an untested theory, but that's why I think that cue came about. But like I said, I think it is a good starting point. I just don't think it's the right ending point in many cases.
Right, and that goes towards some of the things that you were bringing up of, well, how much load are you interested in putting on your shoulders?
Yes.
How much flexibility work are you trying to get from your hamstrings? How much flexibility work are you trying to get through the calves?
Exactly.
It would be easy if there was one position that optimized all three of those things.
That's right.
That's not the case. A shorter pose might work towards one thing, and a longer pose might work towards another thing. So you can't just say this is the one alignment. for
That's
all.
right.
It's like, well, what's the goal? What's the biomechanical goal that you're after in this moment, actually, because that might not be the same every time you
Yeah.
practice it today or today and in this moment. And then you can decide how long to make your down dog.
100%, Travis. I think you put that so well. Yeah, it's like all about what's your goal and intention in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And as a yoga teacher, you may have like a theme for the class. Like maybe you're trying to you increase shoulder strength or something. So you may even want people not only to have like that plank length down dog, you might want them to start working with a longer down dog than that.
Mm-hmm.
Like down dog and then step their feet further back or walk their hands. So then
and you did a really nice job explaining that in the video. I think the easiest way to think about it is when you're in down dog, if you were to walk your hands closer to your feet, the load will shift towards your lower body. And the way to see that from an extreme standpoint is you could walk your hands from down dog to forward fold. And we know that in forward fold, our weight is mostly on our feet, right?
That's right.
So as you walk your hands in, the weight shifts towards the feet. Your legs get more vertical. And then as you walk your hands out and out and out, the load gets more into the upper body.
That's right, which is why a longer down dog tends to be harder. But
Mm-hmm.
what else does a longer down dog do, like say at the ankle?
That's especially tricky for me.
Yes.
Well, I'm not particularly flexible in my hamstrings or my calves, so I take the middle approach, because when you walk your hands out and load the shoulders more, you also need to go into more dorsiflexion.
That's right.
Which puts a greater stretch on your calves.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you walk your hands in, it puts you more into hip flexion, and it puts a greater stretch on your hamstrings. So from there's the way to, okay, what are we trying to load? Are we wanting to load the upper body down, like longer down dog? What are we trying to stretch? Trying to stretch the calves. Let's press our heels down towards the floor. In a longer down dog, are we trying to stretch our hamstrings? We can shorten it a little bit.
100%. So there are like all these different factors and variables that we can take into account. And I think that's why there really isn't one quote right length for down dog. But I still do, just kind of as a general like default, I like starting a plank and pressing back, especially if you think of how many times we visit down dog in a typical practice. It's like many, many times. And it's probably not most times we're in there that we're actually trying to focus on a specific thing.
Yeah.
So just, if we have a specific theme that we're layering on, then maybe we start to tweak with those. Or if a student has pain, like shoulder pain, maybe they want to embody a shorter down dog temporarily because that will load the shoulders less. Maybe they'll experience that. Might be another reason that you might tweak your down dog.
Yeah.
And talking about the calves, actually, it made me think to ask you this question. This is super related, but a little bit different. In downward facing dog, are we supposed to have our heels on the floor? Because you were saying, like, if you wanted to stretch your calves, you could walk your hands forward. Right. But then I was like, well, what if someone just lifted their heels?
Right. That's really the complicating factor, is you have a certain amount of dorsiflexion. So if you're insisting on keeping your heels pressed to the floor as you shorten or lengthen your down dog, then it does create more of a stretch through the ankle, through the calf. Yeah. But if you just let your heels come up, then it actually doesn't.
That's right. So if you do a long down dog and the heels lift, then you actually won't get the calf
so that's a common question that we get.
We got that multiple times for this episode.
Do your heels need to stay on the ground? And I think a related one is, do your knees need to stay straight?
Yes, Travis, these are both related.
If you look at the pictures in the books, like heels tend to be on the ground and knees tend to be straight. So that's like the quintessential embodiment of the pose.
That's right.
I guess you could say. But there's the yoga police aren't going to arrest you if you bend your knees a little bit and your heels pop off the ground a little bit. It's still a down dog. It's
100%.
So I think that both of those things are perfectly acceptable. And in certain people's bodies, either in this moment or forever, they're just not going to get a perfect knee extension and perfect dorsiflexion, heels to the ground, and that's okay. It could be if that's a goal, then like on an individual basis, it could be something that you work towards, but it doesn't have to be, and it can just be that your down dog has a little bit of knee bend and heels off the ground. And personally, for me, that's what it looks like, because I find that helps me, one, be more comfortable, but two, also like press back into it a little bit more and get like
Yeah.
more
Oh,
thoracic
yeah.
extension by bending the knees. So it's like this compromise between all of the different things. Like if I keep my legs really straight, I end up being in like a down dog plank hybrid. Just
Right, because it
like
pushes you forward, is what you're
yeah,
saying. Yeah, if you
yeah,
straighten your knees because
yeah,
of your hamstring flexibility.
yeah. So and I
Yeah,
think many people probably can relate that you
absolutely.
it's a trade-off.
It's a
You,
trick.
you, you
Yeah.
pick what's going to be best for you in the moment that's most comfortable to feel like you're embodying the pose the way that makes
Yes.
sense to you.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's such a good example. Yeah. Yeah, so flexibility is like a major player here. And when we are quote tighter like through the backs of the legs, if we force the knees straight, that necessarily is then going to shift things like so that you're in less shoulder flexion, like your arms will be less overhead. You might round your spine a little
Right.
bit,
Right. So
which
if
is
you have
fine.
a certain amount of hamstring length, if you take it away from the knees, then you will go into more hip extension, which is taking you out of down, like the high hips that we quote unquote like in down dog.
That's right. That's right. So bending the knees may be a helpful strategy for keeping that reaching back energy that we often like there and for really
Yeah.
being able to come into the full shoulder flexion. Like you said, it's a trade-off. Separately from downward facing dog, or perhaps in your times in down dog, people who would like to move toward the straight knees and the heels down, they could work on hamstring flexibility and ankle flexibility, like separately, right? Like just like take that on as a goal.
Right.
Which you could do a bit of in down dog, but I think there are other movements and exercises for that that are more effective.
Do you think that if you can have your heels on the ground and straighten your knees, down dog is a more restful pose?
You're asking me that because I can do that in my body. So you just mean like from my personal experience? Yeah. Well, I think it depends on what you mean by restful, because if you mean like
right.
free from the discomfort of feeling a lot of stretch,
Yeah,
then
that's the
yes.
tricky thing, because you could still have relatively weak shoulders and your
Mm-hmm.
shoulders are burning.
Yes.
So it's like
what do you mean?
Is it what's making it not restful for you? Is it the pressing through the shoulders? Personally, for me, that's not the case.
You're
But
strong
it
in your
is
upper
like,
body.
yeah, but I feel a lot of effort stretching through the hamstrings.
Yes, and that is effort as well. It's just more
Yeah.
like discomfort effort, I guess,
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
like working your muscles discomfort.
Yeah, just like not feeling like totally at rest in that pose,
That's
because
right.
it's a pretty intense position.
So as we alluded to earlier, we mentioned this earlier, but there's a very common kind of phrase in the yoga world that like down dog is a resting pose. What I remember kind of coming up in the yoga world is teachers would say, down dog might not feel like a resting pose to you today, but you're going to find that it will become as you like get more flexible or whatever. Like it might feel hard for you now. And I remember it was really hard. Like people who haven't
So
done down before.
that has been true in your experience.
In my experience, yes. But I know that for many other people, that's
no,
not true.
Never gets easier for me.
Exactly. So I do think it raises the question of like how helpful of a phrase is that to use? Like, because could it make people
like,
feel bad?
Yeah, it's discouraging.
It's discouraging.
I'm supposed to be resting here and I'm exerted.
Struggling.
Yeah, but I can appreciate the notion that it's you might aspire to. This might be a hard pose at first, and I know for some beginners it's not a pose that they can do.
That's
in which
right,
case
Travis.
Maybe they use a chair, or they elevate their hands, or we can maybe talk.
Actually, maybe we should talk about that. Do you want to?
Yeah,
that's kind of on our how to progress and regress down dog.
Yeah,
this might be a good time to talk about that because it can be such a struggle for people. And then for other people, they might feel like, oh, I don't feel anything here. So how could they maybe shift it so that it starts to be more challenging? Like how could you tailor it a little bit? And I think this kind of ties into just understanding more about the anatomy and biomechanics of what are going on. What is going on?
I think the fact that we've spent an hour explaining what's happening.
Yeah.
Now the modifications hopefully will make a lot of sense.
Right. So let's say, Travis, you're in down dog and it's like a big struggle for you.
Mm-hmm.
What are some strategies for how you might regress or make it less challenging? What could you
I
do?
personally like to do my down dog with yoga blocks under my hands.
Yes. That's an
Because
excellent option.
for a couple of reasons, it shifts some of the load back to the lower body.
Like out of the upper body because
Yeah,
your
which
hands are higher.
isn't really for me the
For
reason
you,
I'm
that's
doing it.
not
For
right.
me, it's I don't need as much hip flexion and
Mm-hmm.
hamstring. It lessens the intensity of the hamstring stretch.
Because you're lifted up more.
Yeah, and does that also? It also decreases the ankle.
The calf, I think it
Yeah,
does. I think it does. Yeah. So it
double
could just
whammy.
make, yeah, the whole backside feel a little more easeful.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, if someone struggled in down dog because their arms felt tired or their shoulders felt weak, then elevating the hands up on blocks or even higher on a
Right.
chair seat or on a
Yep.
wall, that's a common down dog variation is down dog hands on the wall.
I think that would be a really relevant option for people who are having pain.
Yes.
So we talked for 15 minutes about externally rotating the shoulder.
Yeah.
And sure, that's an option, but
It's
another
one of
option is
many
just to
options, right?
reduce the load on the shoulders. Maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
not so much, well, this particular joint angle and position is provocative. It's just like, this is a lot for the person in this moment. And if you can offload them, put their hands on blocks, which
Yep.
shifts some of the load back into the legs. Now their shoulders, maybe you've taken, maybe there was some threshold that was creating pain. And if you can lower that threshold, then you can stay on the right side of that.
100%. That's a really good additional modification because, yeah, cueing people to externally rotate is just one of many things. But elevating the hands, another thing someone who might have pain in their shoulders could do is they could widen their hands or narrow, like just change something about how the shoulders are working. So maybe widening the hands or narrowing the hands so that they're closer together could be a way, or like you said, they could externally rotate. They could also try internally rotating and just see if that changes the pain that they're, because we know pain is multifactorial. It's so many things can be.
Maybe they've been externally rotating forever and maybe they just don't have to think about that. Maybe they can internally rotate back to like a neutral rotation.
Yes.
By removing the cue that they've been trying to layer on top, maybe that helps.
Just like it almost could just be novel. It could like change the experience of what they're so used to. Right. So those are some good ideas for either regressing down dog or maybe modifying it temporarily for pain, like people who have pain in the moment. What about like the other side of things and just ramping up down dog and making it more challenging or progressing it? What could you do?
Well, you tell me.
Well,
I'm not in a position that I need to make it any harder.
One of the first things I think, well, I for sure think, and we've already talked about this, is just make your down dog longer.
Right.
So walk your hands forward a little or your feet, make it long. That alone is going to make it harder. But aside from that, I think you could elevate your feet.
As soon as I turned the question back to you, I was like, yeah, that's
you remembered. Yeah, so feet on blocks.
And we do that. We have down dog push-ups in our programs, and I think we have feet elevated down dog push-ups.
I think we do, Travis. I think and also
on blocks or on a bench.
So the higher feet are, the more load you're putting into the upper body.
Yep.
And then if you did actual push-ups, which we don't normally do in down dog, but that's a great strength.
That would also be a way to make it harder.
Yeah.
Instead of taking your 5 breaths, do 5 down dog push-ups.
And just so people know what that is, because they may not, it just means that you would bend your elbows out to the sides and bring like your head toward the floor and then straighten again. That's
all while keeping your down dog shape.
Exactly. That would be, and that's super, like if people haven't tried that before, they should give that a try. It's very hard.
You also, as a progression in between that, so there's holding down dog, there's down dog push-ups. You could just go back and forth between plank and down dog. I think that might have been an option that we offered people if down dog push-ups was too difficult.
I think you're right, Travis. We're talking in our Strength for Yoga remote group training.
So it's like, all right, everybody is used to doing down dog in a yoga class. How can we make this harder? Well, we could do
Yes.
push-ups, but if down dog push-ups are
Too
crazy
hard.
in this moment, just going back and forth between plank and down dog could give you a strengthening stimulus.
Yeah, 100%. And you could do that with your feet on blocks too. Would make it even like a little more, because in yoga, I think in yoga we do kind of frequently do that movement, plank to down dog, and sometimes we do it repeatedly.
Yeah.
So it makes it harder if you do a bunch
like
in a
12
row.
times in a row.
Yeah, exactly. But if that's not hard enough, try feet on blocks and then do it and see how that is. Like, so there other ways you could make down dog more challenging are, well, this isn't the best example because it's very common, like lift a leg into down dog splits, but we tend to see that quite a bit. But another maybe more challenging way would be lift an arm in downward facing dog.
Oh, damn.
So you could lift it just straight up off the floor, or you could take it back.
Photo shoot pictures of you doing that.
Oh, you're right.
Looks pretty cool.
Yeah, so where it's the arm and the leg.
It's good if you're doing a photo shoot.
It's good for photos.
Oh yeah, the down dog with a raised arm and a leg.
That's so hard, but I think we have a picture of me doing that. Yeah. So you could lift an arm keeping both feet down, or you could lift one leg and one arm, which is like the hardest of the hard. But those definitely make down dog
or
more
lift
challenging
2 legs.
as well. And then you're in handstand.
Or just practicing kick-ups. Not going all the way up, but doing like a little hop up into it and then coming back down. That's actually my first inclination was a joke, but because it's actually handstand. But my second inclination is like, oh, that's actually a serious.
You're totally right. So like do down dog and just hop up both legs and come down, like donkey kicks or whatever you might call that. That's a great, that totally steps things up.
It's not really down dog anymore, but it's
a down dog variation. Yeah. So those are all some ways. Oh, what were you going to say?
Down dog push-offs.
Oh yeah, that's in our strength for yoga.
From down dog to standing.
That's such a good and very rarely seen. So what that is it's great. You should try it if you've not tried it. It's down dog, and then what you do is you rapidly push off the floor through your arms so that you spring all the way back and up to standing.
And you might transition through like a halfway lift.
Yes, you could.
Because rather than just like, well, let me hold that inverted V and in one fell swoop, crazy upper body power to get back up. It's like, well, I can push back into sort of like a forward fold or halfway lift and then come up to standing.
And what makes it more accessible, it's really hard to do from a typical down dog length, but if you shorten the down dog, like I'll come into down dog and then I walk my hands toward my feet quite a bit, and then you like bend your elbows and then spring off.
Or start on a couple blocks to try it first. See like, I can do this. I know what this feels like. And
make it a little easier.
Yeah.
But that's a great down dog variation. That's playing with, like you said, power, or like using your strength rapidly or quickly through the upper body.
An interesting transition straight from down dog or a short down dog up into standing.
Yeah, totally.
Couple other modifications, and this would be maybe somewhat particular cases, but if you were experiencing wrist discomfort, you could elevate the palm, or not the palm, the wrist. The heel of the hand. The heel of the hand, on a yoga mat, or not a yoga mat, a rolled up blanket,
or a towel or something.
To create a wedge. Or a towel, So just, you don't need to be in as much extension. And that's probably not going to be an issue for most people because it's just, you're not in full extension. That might come into play in plank. And you could do the same thing at the other side. So yoga blanket under the heels to ground. So you might not be able to get your heels all the way down to the ground, but if you want to feel that sensation, then having a yoga blanket underneath your heels can allow a more even distribution of pressure under the foot. That's a great idea. And it also kind of gives you something to push into if you want to actively like push your heels down, and that may help with like as a calf flexibility exercise as well, just like finding that active. You roll the blanket up 6 times this week and 4 times next week. Maybe
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, those are great. Those are great variations. Yeah, just other ways you can approach downward facing dog. Why don't we just take a quick look at maybe a few other kind of more miscellaneous questions that we received about
Sure.
down dog? One of them that we got from a few people was, what about down dog and pregnancy? And I thought this was a really good question. Like, is down dog okay to practice when you're pregnant? And I don't really know. I'm not a prenatal yoga teacher, but I actually asked our friend, Lauren Anderson, who is
Shout out Lauren Anderson.
exactly. She's great. She actually has some prenatal classes on my website, and she wrote a great article about like top 4 yoga myths about pregnancy that's on my blog.
Which
So
we'll
we
link
can,
in the show notes.
yes, we will link in the show notes. And Lauren's amazing. She has a really great evidence-based prenatal yoga program, or pre and postnatal yoga teacher training program, which is great because in the sea of yoga, as we know, there's a lot of misinformation, and there's maybe more when it comes to pregnancy.
There's a lot of misinformation about pregnancy. Well,
exactly.
in general, specifically, I mean about exercise, not even just in the yoga context.
Right. You're totally right. Like in general about pregnancy, but especially like, pregnancy
like, oh, it's not
exercise.
Safe to exercise when you're pregnant in general. Like people think that.
They think they can't do it. And it's actually super important and beneficial to exercise all the way through. Of course, unless someone has certain contraindications. And we are not the medical professionals to advise. Yeah. And that's actually.
We can make some general recommendations, right?
Yeah, for sure. And so with that caveat that like anybody wondering should truly ask their medical provider. But here's what Lauren told us about downward facing dog was that it's as with everything, it's an it depends case. But in general, if down dog is a pose that you've been practicing before you were pregnant, so your body is like already familiar and conditioned with it, and if you don't have certain contraindications like high blood pressure, you get lightheaded or dizzy easily, things like that, then it's considered to be a safe pose, like not one that needs to be avoided. But of course, people should check with their doctor. But that's what Lauren said. And I thought that was really helpful. She said, I'm just going to read a quick thing. She said, usually if someone shouldn't do a pose, it's not because of the pose itself. It's because their provider is worried that they'll get lightheaded and faint or fall or something like that. But it's not necessarily like down dog is bad for pregnancy, but just maybe there are concerns about lightheadedness or even nausea if those are things that are going on for you during your pregnancy.
Yeah. So that down dog, and I think maybe the same would apply to handstand, which is just taking down dog to the nth degree of just
totally.
There's probably a lot of concern surrounding that. And
all inversions.
Yeah. And it's more like, well, if you've been doing it, then you can continue to do it until it doesn't feel comfortable anymore, potentially, unless there's the risk of lightheadedness, falling,
yes,
and so on.
Yeah,
and always check with your doctor.
100%. But just to give an example of that, back in my Ashtanga days, our teachers were a married couple, and the wife became pregnant with twins at one point, and she'd practiced Ashtanga forever and also had been a dancer before that. So she was just really well adapted to all of those movements throughout so much of her life. So through her whole pregnancy, she did all of her super gnarly, intense Ashtanga, which included things like handstand and then dropping down into wheel pose. So like handstand, bring your feet to the floor, and then reversing that, like feet back up, like spring them up and then down. So just, she was just really adapted for that. Definitely not recommending that for everybody at all, but just like as an example, like what your body had already been doing can often be okay. You don't need to suddenly I have to stop.
You haven't dropped into wheel from handstand and gone back before you're pregnant. Now's not the time to start.
Yes, 100%. So that was one of the questions. Maybe we can do like one more question, and I think a lot of these other questions we've actually kind of covered already. I have a question to throw out at you, Travis. I'm curious what you think about this. I've heard this claimed, and I just wonder what you think. This has to do with when your intention is to stretch your hamstrings. So we've talked about sometimes like if if your hamstrings are tight and down dog feels uncomfortable, you could like bend your knees or whatever. But what if actually you want to use down dog to increase flexibility, like to stretch the hamstrings? So something that people say is what you have to do, you will not be stretching your hamstrings in yoga unless you are lifting your tailbone. Or another way of saying that is anteriorly tilting your pelvis. So it's like, if you want it to be an effective hamstring stretch, you have to find that anterior pelvic tilt or the tailbone lift in order to stretch the hamstrings.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think there's a grain of truth to that, but not a full truth, just a half truth. So like if you go to do, is it called a runner's stretch, where you put your one leg up on a bench or chair or something?
Oh yeah.
You can feel this right away. So put your leg up and then you play with anteriorly or posteriorly tilting your pelvis. And because of where the hamstring attaches on your pelvis, when you anteriorly tilt, it creates more length through the hamstring. So the question is, how much? And if you're in down dog and you do that or don't do that, does it turn off the stretch? And I guess it depends on the person, perhaps. So maybe they get into down dogs like me, and it doesn't matter what they're doing with their pelvis. They feel a stretch right away.
Right.
To the point where you have to bend your knee. Otherwise, it's too intense. But maybe the person doesn't feel anything with their knee bent. They straighten the knee. They still don't feel anything.
Yeah.
Maybe adding that volitional anterior tilt will get to them to the point of feeling that stretch. So if they are particularly flexible, then that's certainly an option and a way to intensify it. But I don't think you are not stretching. I mean, you're lengthening it no matter what. This pelvic tilt is a few degrees that's putting a few more whatever units of lengthening on the hamstring. So I don't think you're not stretching it if you're in posterior tilt and then suddenly you are stretching it. I think you would be stretching it more in an anterior tilt, and maybe for an individual, they need that in order to feel it.
That's such a great answer. Thank you for saying. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me, and is pretty much what I had been thinking as well. I also was just kind of in my mind adding in there that like the hamstrings, they cross the hip, and so therefore, pelvic position matters, but also they cross the knee. And so the position of the knee matters as well. So it's kind of like, well, what else are you doing with your knees? And what if your knees, if they were super bent, then maybe you're not stretching them from that end. So lifting the tailbone could add a stretch. But if you're...
what happens if you anteriorly tilt and then your knees bend?
Exactly.
You've made no change. And that could happen. Right?
It totally could happen.
You're told, I need to make sure I'm anteriorly tilting, and then you don't realize that you're stealing the length by
bending
going
your
into
knees.
The same degree of knee flexion to counteract that. So if you're keeping your knees straight and you're anteriorly tilting, then sure, you're getting more of a hamstring stretch. Yeah,
then you might get the maximal, but I think only for very flexible people would they really need to really be maximizing it on both ends.
What do you think about it?
That's a great question. I don't think about it. I don't. I just think of
that's your homework.
Piking my hips back. Yeah, you mean like in my own practice? Do I think about lifting the tailbone?
Yeah.
Down dog. Yeah. No, I don't, because to me that just it's kind of like that. It's like externally rotating the shoulders. It's like, I mean, I might for a particular reason in a particular moment. I want to do some pelvic tilts here, but as a default rule, I don't go into down dog and then lift my tailbone. Just like I don't go into down dog and then externally rotate my shoulders. It's like I'll just kind of let the body be.
Nice.
But it depends on goals.
Yeah, right. You already have not naturally. You've worked on and have developed very flexible hamstrings.
Right. Especially through our strength for yoga practice, which has targeted my hamstrings so well.
Right.
So true. Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of, I think you gave a perfect answer. In my mind, it's like, I think that the tailbone can certainly be involved, and pelvic tilt and down dog can be involved in a hamstring stretch, but I think it's a lot more nuanced, and it depends than just saying, you're not going to stretch your hamstrings unless you're in an anterior pelvic tilt.
Yeah. And I like what you said. You can treat that as an exploration.
Yeah.
But just like with the shoulder.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. But it doesn't need to be, you don't need to think you're not like stretching your hamstrings if you're not in an anterior pelvic tilt.
If you feel your hamstring stretching, then you're stretching your hamstrings.
100%. So, with that, Travis, do you think we've kind of covered this whole down dog topic pretty well and thoroughly?
I think so.
I think so too. I think this was anatomy, biomechanics, cueing, alignment rules, maybe some myths, and hopefully some just clarity that we can bring to really.
Last thing, and then we'll go. If you were cueing down dog in a class, we've talked at length about,
oh my gosh,
you don't need to say these things. What would you say?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Like, what would you cue that? And you're right. We did get this as a couple questions. Like, how would you cue down dog? It just me personally, I try to keep it simple as I try to with most things. And then maybe I add on some exploration or some focus I'm focusing on in the class that's very contextual. But as far as just teaching out of the box down dog, I would probably do it pretty simply. Maybe start on hands and knees, walk your hands forward a little bit because, if you go straight to down dog from there, you'll be in kind of a narrow down dog. So walk your hands forward a little bit and then lift your hips up and back. And I might say lift your hips up and back toward the place where the ceiling and the wall meet. It's a little bit of a wordy cue, but like that, I think that visualization or that like external target to reach your hips toward can be helpful for just kind of self-organizing the pose. Mm-hmm. Often push the floor away. I like that. Push the floor away through the arms, kind of helps light up what's going on through the upper body. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of it. And then I may, observational things like, what do you feel through the hip? What happens if you do this?
Yeah. What about like lengthen through the spine, or is that not even on the horizon?
So great. Yes, I do sometimes teach that. Sometimes I'll say like, feel your whole spine from the crown of your head to your tailbone. Or from your tailbone to the crown, like see if you can embody that as like one unit. And just that alone, like feeling from tailbone to crown of head or lengthening from tailbone to crown of head can kind of light up some 360-degree core engagement, like all the way around. Mm-hmm. And may reposition.
Down dog's not a core exercise.
Yeah.
Exactly. But certainly, yeah, you can bring some awareness.
That's right. Just like light up a little more engagement. But cool, yeah, thanks. I tend to keep the shapes pretty simple and then layer on. Yeah, exactly. But that's just me. Everyone might have their own approach.
Adho, mukha, svanasana.
You said it so well.
Thank you.
Downward facing dog. Thank you so much for talking about this surprisingly complex yoga asana that we have in our hands.
Well, thank you, Jenni.